right, so my name is Daniel Chadbourne. I have a master's in psychology. I'm currently a full-time instructor at Southeastern Louisiana University and part of Brony Study. Brony Study started actually about 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, by Dr. Patrick Edwards and Dr. Marcia Redden to study the fandom, to look at not just the Bronies, but eventually move on to looking at fandom in general. And currently, so far, we've collected around 40,000 participants worth of data. We've done 3 major studies. We've exposed an unwitting class of Psychology 101 students to an episode of My Little Pony, and gathered their data back and forth. And we've got a couple of future projects coming up. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Brony Study, and then do a bit of a Q&A. That's what we've done in the past at some of the other conventions, and I think that's a little more fun and engaging than me talking about statistics for the next 30 to 40 minutes. So, generally what we found is sort of a brief overview is that the Bronies don't differ that much at all from any non-Brony that's out there. We found some slight differences when you look at personality in terms of like introversion, extroversion, and conscientiousness. But it turns out that you're going to find that in any group of people who use the internet a lot. Though Bronies tend to be a little more agreeable, so they're nicer, they're easier to get along with, and a little more adaptable. Some of our early research even looked at the concept of there are different types of Bronies, and we have a Brony typology. There are 4 key types of Bronies, and typically what you see within the community, or the Bronies that make up the vast majority of the community, are either social Bronies, and they're Bronies who are out there. I'm a Brony. This is the show I'm interested in. They're very vocal about that. And then there are the secret Bronies, who were the people who would come to a convention like this and say, I'm going to visit some friends, or I'm going to an anime convention. Something like that, you know, just to kind of, but that may come from a lot of different reasons. And what we're looking at with some of the data, where we have a manuscript that's soon to be published in an American Psychological Association journal. We've got several presentations that are going to be at several conventions throughout the Southeast and Southwest over the next couple of months, 6 to 8 months. And what we're finding is that what it really comes down to, or one of the things that may come down to, that social versus secret come from the community in which the person lives. If there are people around them that allow them an outlet, people can talk about being Bronies, you're going to see more of that social Brony versus, excuse me, secret Brony. So some of the stuff that we've been working on recently, and I've been told Dr. Psychology, who's Dr. Edwards, who couldn't make it, he's in South Carolina. One of the things that we're currently working on is a longitudinal study. It's a long-term study for the next 2 to 3 years. We're going to be looking at the Bronies as a whole. And right now we've got about 2,400 participants signed up. It's a brief survey on things like personality, and a couple of bits of information about the fandom, participation within the fandom. So we're really interested now. We have a pretty good understanding of what the fandom is like, but also where the fandom is moving, what happens over time, what makes people leave and come back. We had performed before BronyCon, and we talked about this at BronyCon. We did a former fan survey where we got a large group of ex-Bronies to respond to a survey. And one of the things that we found is that 40% of them said that they're still not necessarily gone, and 60% said that they're going to watch season 4. So while we have this group of individuals who may consider themselves Bronies no longer, they're not far gone. They're going to be coming back for season 4. I think Dr. Edwards calls them dormant Bronies. Go dormant, season 4 happens, everyone's back and excited again. And as it gets closer and closer, I think you'll see more people coming out with that. And as for the future, we're hoping to launch, I'm hoping to launch in the next couple of weeks. We're going to do a fandom comparison study. We're going to start looking at other fandoms. We have a pretty good idea of things like function and purpose and sort of meaning that comes from the Brony community. And one of the sort of the two big reasons why this study got started was to look at these social communities and the function that they play within society, within human interaction, and also to see them from the start. We can't really study Trekkies, we can't really study Star Wars fans from the beginning. They've been around for so long. So upon hearing about bronies from his son, Dr. Edwards decided, well, maybe we should look into this, especially with some of the stereotypes that were coming out at the time. And for the most part, Brony Study has been a great means to dispel a lot of the negative stereotypes associated. I respond with what Dr. Edwards generally responds to when anyone wants to talk bad about the bronies, that we have 40,000 participants worth of data. Where are you getting your information from? So we've got a wide array of information and plans. We're not just sort of going dormant ourselves. We're working on a lot of projects and sifting through those massive data sets that we still have. We're still finding new information about them. We're still looking at different variables that we have not really delved into. Generally, I guess I'll open up to a sort of general Q&A. There's some aspect you might want to know more about. Yes?
I'd like to know, since I'm familiar with your study and your data collected, I'd like to know what your types, as far as an average, is there I understand the younger bronies might be a little more quiet about it as opposed to those like me or in their 30s. And
right.
Have you noticed a general trend of age as far as their personality type? Is there a point where when you're in high school, you're smaller, and then you open up more, and then in your late 20s, you might become dormant again, and then open it back up?
I don't think we've looked at age specifically as a comparison, but that would be an interesting way to go. One of the things that we're looking for, and we're maybe hoping to present in April to the Southwest Psychological Association, and this was something I just talked about this morning with Dr. Edwards, is the idea of community as being a part of it, and not just the difference between the Brony community as compared to someone's outside actual community. But if you were from a larger city or a larger, more urban area, and you had more bronies around you, and you had, we're in a larger setting to where you can interact with more people who are bronies. That what we're looking at is that may be a good predictor of being a social brony versus a secret brony. But maybe in a smaller community or in a more rural area, or even if you started looking at maybe liberal versus conservative communities, especially when we look at gender roles and gender stereotyping, you would probably see some sharp differences. One of the things that we noticed pretty consistently with the exposure study and what we did in that, for those of you not familiar, we had a group of our intro psych students take a series of surveys. We told them that they were going to be watching something from a fandom, and then when they came in for that day, we had them watch an episode of My Little Pony. So they filled out some forms, they watched half an episode, they rated how they felt about the episode, then they watched the other half and rated it again. And what we found is that before the episode, that individuals who scored higher on measures for gender stereotyping and gender roles, so what men should do, what women should do, what roles they should take, they tended to rate bronies far more negatively. That we had sort of two scales of that. One was looking at they like the show because of the show, it's an outside factor, versus they like the show because there's something maybe wrong with them, that they haven't had enough boy toys or not a strong father figure in their life or something like that. So that concept of gender stereotyping could have a play, especially in more rural areas. The one thing we did find is while we couldn't make someone a brony, there were certain personality characteristics, there were certain factors that would make someone more likely to rate the show very highly and to say, yes, I would watch it again. One of those being if they knew another brony. And then after watching the show, even individuals who were very strongly against it or very, they must be girly men, they must be effeminate. It shifted. So we actually saw them saying, okay, maybe it is because of the music or the animation or the humor. And that slight shift over to the side is sort of basic in what you would see with prejudice reduction, that when you expose someone to maybe something that they don't understand, that understanding kind of comes into play. So while you can't turn someone into a brony, if you show them an episode, they can maybe better understand where bronies are coming from. We showed them the Flim Flam episode. It had some humor, it had good music, and then there were also there were more male characters in it, and that was to really play into that gender stereotype, to give someone sort of a more equal, sort of that equal male-female character FaceTime. No, I think someone converted all of those statistics into a, I know that they did like a big, what do they call it? Like an infographic. They took the data from Brony Study, and you can actually see all of our data from the first 2 surveys. I'm not sure if we've updated with some of the information from the 3rd survey yet. You can access the information for the longitudinal study all on our website, which is bronystudy.com. And eventually we're going to start putting stuff with the fandom comparison. So when we start looking at some other fandoms, and not just like anime and certain movies, but also like sports fandoms and music fandoms and things like that. What about Homestuck? Yeah, that would be something good to look into. Maybe presenting it to like the Microsoft Paint Adventures forums and whatnot. And that's one of the methods that we're going to use is try to get the information out there. And really, what we're hoping is, and the hardest thing about studying fandoms is because fandoms can get such a bad rap, even within the psychological community. One of the things that we got back when presenting our first paper for publication was, you need more to it. I mean, who's looking at this? And there's not a whole lot. There's a lot of people in marketing, but psychologists haven't really looked at fandoms. It's almost been seen as a sort of a deviance, that fan comes from fanatic, but it's really, we're trying to stress the importance of things like identity development and community building and a lot of the positive, and especially what we're showing with the Brony community, a lot of the positive outcomes that can come from this. But in talking with some other fandoms, it can be difficult because when you say a bunch of scientists want to come in and start testing your fandom, usually the first thing I get is oh, we've seen what has happened before. And you can see with the furry fandom that happened. There was a study that came out 10 plus years after the furry fandom had started. They collected a bunch of data from a very specific group of individuals, and there were really, it painted, I think, the group as a whole in a bad light. And then there's a lot of marketing people interested into it. So especially with 2 years of Brony Study data, that's been probably the biggest help that I've seen, looking at other people saying, look, if you're worried about what we're going to show, this is what we're looking at, this is what we've done in the past, and we're going to present the data as we find it, but we're really looking at sort of the function. No, I'm all for looking at the Homestuck fandom. I'm still catching up myself, so. Nothing else. Yeah, that would be something interesting to look at. I think the difficult part of that, we can maybe look at our large groups. I think with the 3rd survey, we had looked at something like 14,000 bronies. And what's interesting about that is that when it comes to psychology, that's going beyond the level of just a small sample or getting into like a population there's a lot of numbers. But looking at, so we asked, I think we asked country of origin. I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head if we asked state of origin. But we looked at country of origin, so not just U.S. bronies, but bronies from overseas. And there might be some interesting things, and I think you would see the same with community size too. That and that's something I think we're working on delving into with some of that data for the future. Talk about other things besides Brony Study. We could talk about psychology. I'm trying to think if there's any new information out. One of the things that we are planning to do, and I'm sort of just waiting on a data set, we asked, and this was something that was asked a year ago, but we asked in our second or third data set, favorite pony. And that's something sort of beyond what the hub was looking at, because I know that there was a bit of an outcry because of that. But that was something we never looked at, and we never really took anything with the data. But that's one of the things that we have planned. I'm just waiting on getting my hands on the data set, because they didn't ask, like, bubble in your answer. They left it free response. So it becomes a little harder to code. When you've got 14,000 of them to go through, it's going to become a little more difficult to pull that through, but we definitely are going to look at sort of favorite pony. And one of the things I'm really interested in, and where my sort of focus in the research group is the idea of identity development, especially with online communities and the big sort of crisis. And if you look at Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, how we go through these crises throughout our lives. The big stage at the point most bronies are entering the fandom is that identity versus identity development, or identity versus role confusion. So forming an identity and having a positive outlet to express yourself, to create art and music, and if you're interested in all sorts of things, you can apply or use ponies in this case to work towards that concept of identity development. And one of the things that we might look into with favorite pony is whether or not who your favorite pony is says something about your own identity. And that maybe the pony that you pick is either who you most associate with or who you most want to be.
Have you seen the Myers-Briggs chart?
We're not a fan of Myers-Briggs. Well, I'll explain that. No, and I understand that. I get the Myers-Briggs and why it's so easily. One of the things that we had talked to Coder Brony about, who does the herd census, he had done some stuff on the Myers-Briggs. Our only problem in psychology, we could never get anything published with the Myers-Briggs. It's about 50 years out of date. And the introversion extroversion is really good with it. I believe the second of the four factors is okay, but it gets really subjective when you start looking at it. It's very Jungian, but what we tend to use today is the big five. So introversion, extroversion, conscientiousness, which is sort of organization. There's a wide variety of other factors with conscientiousness. Openness to new experience. We've actually found that bronies tend to be overall more open. Agreeableness or likability versus, Pinkie Pie would probably be very highly agreeable versus Cranky, the donkey being very low agreeable. So that's a good sort of agreeable analogy. And then neuroticism, which is emotional stability. You might say that Fluttershy would be very high neuroticism. And you can actually take the ponies, and I used to do this for a class. I did a personality in the internet assignment, and when I'd get to the big five, I'd have them determine which of the five personality characteristics by describing each of the ponies. I don't know how many of my class actually enjoyed that, but it was an interesting bit. And you can kind of see many of the personality characteristics. And you can see a lot of different ones, but I think that also comes to the fact that the ponies are well written enough that they emulate reality. I mean, they're well written enough to where you can see a lot of those differences. And it's also good to say that because there's this sort of shifting scale, certain stressors and certain life events can move people. So you can see Twilight Sparkle, who might not be very high in neuroticism, when a highly stressful event comes up, becomes highly neurotic because she has a due date that hasn't been met. Or Pinkie Pie, who's very extroverted, because of a stressful event, becomes very introverted, and sort of withdraws within herself, becomes very sort of sad, despondent. So you see a lot of those changes with that. But no, if we were going to look at something like that, it would definitely be a big five, or big five factor rather than the Myers-Briggs, just because of there's some reliability and validity issues with it. There was a psychology and neuroscience panel at BronyCon that used a different factor, and that one would be good if you were writing a character. But again, as far as actually testing and looking at it from a psychologist perspective, it could be very difficult, and you wouldn't really. Yeah, no, it was a good start. It's sort of why I say we still talk about Freud in psychology class, and there's a lot about Freud that we can still move along with today, and there's a lot that kind of sticks, but there are a lot with those initial theories that if we don't update or we don't sort of take into, I guess, some more modern era and a better understanding, sort of building blocks for what we know. Time I have. I think I've got like 10 minutes.
Who's your favorite pony?
Who's my favorite pony? I'd really have to say probably Twilight Sparkle. And most people are like, we've had some people argue with us about that. But for most of us as psychologists, as very scientifically oriented individual, and then also as teachers, Twilight Sparkle is sort of the model student, and as we're saying now, has moved from undergraduate to a graduate student now that she's become an alicorn. She's more of moved on to post-bachelorette.
I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
I know, what exactly, I know Lauren Fox, when she created, she does have a balance as far as her education and psychology.
I didn't know that.
Yes, she did. I wanted to know how much of that you think she put into the development of what pretty much in Genesis was a commercial. Because when we sit and talk about pony, traditionally, at point blank, it's a commercial.
Well, they're trying to sell products, but I think because I was there at the BronyCon 2 years ago when she talked about really working on a show that people could enjoy as well. It's not just she necessarily wasn't coming at it as a means to, or at least to me, she wasn't coming at it as a means to sell toys.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's why she had the
and creating something, and I really think that anyone who writes, gets into a character, starts to understand how people act, or starts to look into things like that. Psychology influences us a lot more than some of us may even admit. I generally tell my students the one thing I love the most about psychology and why I've really felt it's a field for me is because you can study anything. I argue at least that you can study anything in psychology. You might have to look at it a different way. You might have to do some research to figure out how. But I also think we see a lot from behavior, but that may if that background exists, that may help to, I think, maybe get a more accurate feel and make the characters more likable, make them more relatable. But any good writer, any good creator, even without a background in that's sort of a thing you have to balance. Do you have a question? Oh, to see if, and then there's a couple of things. To start with, I think we're going to look at personality, but we've got so many other variables to look at. And I think because we didn't necessarily focus on that or make that the major focus, we're going to use some of the data to see if it can give us some ideas to put out a new survey. And depending on what we find, I would expect you would probably see something on Equestria Daily soon. Maybe within the next couple of months. It's just really, we need to play around with the data a bit. I would hope by the end of the year. maybe getting something up, and really just looking at an identity and favorite pony outlook. We're all kind of looking at different aspects. Jan, who's joined us, is really looking at that prejudice, stereotyping, reduction side. Dr. Edwards and Dr. Redden are both clinical psychologists, so they're very interested in those benefits. There's even talk about here in Louisiana doing a therapy study. We have enough data from parents saying how much help their children have gotten. Children with severe anxiety, severe depression, even dealing with autism and Asperger's, and showing vast improvements after not only watching the show but getting involved in the fandom. So a My Little Ponies therapy study is probably not far in the future. And then I'm a sort of a social psychologist, and I'm starting to delve into developmental psychology. Really, the concept of identity development has kind of stuck with me. How we decide who we are, how we identify with certain aspects in our life. And I think fandom and becoming part of it, so especially a positive online community, what the Brony community can be. There are always going to be negative aspects, but what it can be, I think it's important with that. And really looking at those positive aspects that maybe some people don't want to admit. Fandom can be, as much as outsiders might look at it a little oddly, a very tightly knit fandom can be very, very beneficial. But I think anyone who's a fan knows that. But it's a lot in psychology we can look back on and go, well, of course that's right. Of course that's what's going on. Yeah, and they call that confirmation bias. But looking at it, actually getting some testing, doing some real scientific, data analysis, helps us to confirm that. That way, when someone says, "Well, I don't believe you," you can then say, "We have proof. We have information. We have data to go along with that." I think I've got a couple more minutes, but.
Is there anything that we in this group can do to be more positive for the fandom itself?
Well, and that's actually something we brought up at BronyCon this year. Dr. Edwards played a big part, especially looking at why people leave the fandom and getting information from ex-fans. I talked about the social and the secret bronies, and the other two types of bronies are the renegade bronies. I call them sort of the hipster bronies, and they're only in the fandom for the shock value. They're more likely to stir up stuff, more likely to not really. They don't get anything out of the fandom, but they're very vocal about it. They don't get any sort of meaning or purpose, but they're very vocal about it. And a lot of what we saw leaving very well may be that group. So what we're getting with people within the fandom. Dr. Edwards suggested that really, like Facebook moderators, people running sites, really cracking down a little more on the people who want to start stuff like that. Because in the end, they don't represent the fandom. Sort of the trolls and whatnot, and to really sort of embrace that level of friendship. You don't have to necessarily go to the sort of love and tolerate part, but that level of friendship and understanding that is really sort of espoused in the show. And keeping up with that, keeping that sort of more positive outlook. And he really preaches against the sort of into the world mentality, especially what came after the Twi'lek announcement that sort of, oh well, the fandom's gone, this is horrible that they did this, or there's just a really bad episode, to kind of move past that, because what we found is that the fandom doesn't end because of stuff like that, and every fandom's going to have its schisms and its things like that. So to really keep that level of friendship. I'll just sort of briefly before I think my time's about up. There's another panel coming in. But you can go to bronystudy.com to get a lot of data. It's not the best website in the world. Hopefully we can update it to where it's a little more user friendly to look at. but there's a lot of information, and then there's also information about the longitudinal study. We've got about 2,400 participants already signed up, and right now, I think they're looking to get a little more in before season 4 starts. In the future, it may be a very short survey. You'll get an email. There might be 5 to 10 questions. I mean, nothing major, nothing like the second and third surveys, which were 30 to 45 minutes long. And then also to spread the word about it. One of the things that we're looking for with the fan comparison study is going to be for that. We'd like to see what the Bronies have to say, but we're also looking to get some comparisons with other fan groups. And a lot of that, I think, is going to take some support from the community. If you know someone who's not a Brony, but is a Homestuck fan, or a Whovian, or a fan of really anything else, send them the link, see if they'll take it, because we want to get a good comparison. We want to broaden the field, not just to understand how the Brony fandom works, but how does it apply, what similarities and differences exist. So, right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take my research assistant.